The topic I'll be talking about today is opium in Victorian England. First things first, what is opium? Well, opium is known as a non-synthetic narcotic, meaning it comes naturally from the poppy plant. Opium can be highly addictive and it is psychoactive, meaning it can alter your mood, behavior, perception, consciousness, and other brain functions. Opium is the source of 3 other popular drugs, which include morphine, codeine, and heroin. How is opium taken and what can it do? Opium can be smoked, injected, or taken as a pill. However, if opium is smoked, its effects will act faster. Some of the minor effects include an opium high, similar to a heroin high, constipation, dry mouth, and it can cause dependence or addiction. The major overdose effects include slow breathing, seizures, dizziness, weakness, loss of consciousness, coma, and possibly death. Now let's figure out how it made it to England. First off, in 1606, Elizabeth I instructed the purchase of Indian opium. Second, in 1750, the British East India Company traded opium out of Calcutta to China. Then, in 1793, the British East India Company made a monopoly of the opium trade. In 1830, the British use of opium had reached its high. In 1839, Chinese commissioners demanded traders to give up their opium. Britain responds to this by sending warships, beginning the First Opium War. Between 1841 and 1852, the British won the First Opium War and continued their opium monopoly. In 1856, the Second Opium War occurred, in which the British won and opium was legalized. Then, in 1868, the Pharmacy Act was passed, which limited the sales of opium only to pharmacists. In 1878, the Opium Act gets passed in hopes of decreasing its usage. And then finally, in 1909, the Chinese convinced the British to end the India-China opium trade. With the history behind us, we now look to what common ailments opium was used for. Many used opium for toothaches, bruises, coughs, diarrhea, as a stimulant to calm babies, mental issues like depression, or they used it for recreational use. Nowadays, we have so many regulations on medicine, and easy access is not always possible. So, how did so many people have access to opium back then? Well, it came down to the fact that regulations on these drugs were fairly weak. The reason they were like this was because they did not know much about opium and its effects. It was still new to them, and there was still much to be discovered about the drug, like how you could use it to make morphine. According to Chris Dent's 19th century law, literature, and opium, he states, "The suggestion here is that the law of the time, specifically the law in England, was incapable of regulating the use of such drugs because lawmakers did not have a conception of what mental functioning was, and without such an idea, they had no basis upon which to seek to control the impact of drugs." Some of the impacts opium had on England included some class and racial impacts. For the middle class to use opium, it was seen as respectable. If someone in the middle class had got addicted to it, it was not as big of a deal compared to a working class member getting an opium addiction. It was seen as degenerative for the working class to use opium. And also, since England had made a monopoly out of selling opium to China, oftentimes opium was attributed to the Chinese in a racist sort of way. Some political and economic influences included England's ability to create a monopoly out of selling opium to China, the opium wars that occurred so England could continue selling opium, and it also allowed the British to have the ability to expand its control. Lastly, opium had literary influences as well. In De Quincey's 1821 Confessions of an English Opium Eater, De Quincey talks about what it is like to withdraw from opium. In Collins' The Moonstone, published in 1868, Collins makes many references to opium and its drug trade. Conan Doyle's The Man with the Twisted Lip, published in 1891, and his piece The Sign of Four in 1890, both have hints of opium and opium usage within the story and its characters. And then finally, in the Canterbury Tales, written by Geoffrey Chaucer, we see a character who has drugged someone with what is known as the Opia of Thebes, which is supposed to be the finest opium in the world. Something interesting about opium's history I would like to talk about are opium dens. As you can imagine, these are supposedly small, enclosed areas where people would gather and smoke opium. They gained popularity in literature, however, the state of these dens was often thrown way out of proportion. How they were portrayed in literature were small, tight rooms riddled with crime, filled with addicts, and were portrayed as being all over the place. But what opium dens were actually like was, first off, there were very few of them in England. They were not all bad looking. While there was a bad smell to them, they weren't necessarily riddled with crime. It was just people keeping to themselves and enjoying themselves. And then we reached the end of the opium craze when doctors begin to learn more about opium and its effects on people. Aspirin comes into the picture as a new way to relieve pain, and people become more educated about the dangers of opium. Since opium had racist stereotypes attached to it, those who were stereotyped would be less inclined to use it. Finally, Britain ended the Indian opium trade, which helps bring this dangerous craze to its end. And that is all on opium. Thank you so much for listening.